Welcome all to this Viikki Sustainability Research Seminar, the last session of this spring, focusing on the theme land use and climate action. I still see a lot of participants rolling in, but I think we better get started since we have three really interesting presentations and hopefully a little bit of time afterwards for also sharing and discussion. So my name is Toppinen and I come from HELSUS and I will be chairing this meeting the best I can. I'm working from my iPad because there were some last minute technical difficulties. So if something goes wrong, I hope Heidi, you can inform me.
Yes.
In any case, great. Let's get started. So first presenter is Henrikki Tenkanen, who is a researcher from HELSUS and especially from the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis and as affiliated also with the Digital Geography Lab at our university in Kumpula campus. So without further ado, please, Henrikki, floor is yours, or how do you say it? Air is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see if we now get this going. Okay, I hope you can now see my screen.
Yes, we can.
And hear me as well. Okay, yeah, so thank you very much for having me. It's very interesting to do this kind of presentation, which is my first time, so let's see how it goes. But yeah, what I would like to tell you about today a little bit is basically give you a couple of examples of spatial data analytics and also describe the research work I and the Digital Geography Lab at Helsinki have been doing related to sustainability and especially sustainable mobility. So a bit of background. So I'm a geographer by training and a geodata scientist. I finished my PhD at the Kumpula campus in 2017, and then I moved to UK in 2019, where I currently work at University College London. And in general, I've been interested in using spatial analytics and data mining to study various topical geographic questions, such as sustainability, which has been the topic lately. So as mentioned, we are a group of very interdisciplinary research group where we have people from linguistics, biologists, and geographers, and also people from humanities. Basically, try to use spatial big data analytics to understand and analyze various phenomena on a human scale for fair and sustainable societies. And in general, what I and our research group have been interested is to use these kind of spatial analysis, network analytics, and big data mining to study accessibility and mobility, human environment interactions, and so on. And most of these things are very much related to sustainability as well. And kind of the motivation for our work has always been to kind of try to create tools and knowledge or information for decision making and planners, for example, to make better decisions. And we have been doing this work in urban areas, but also in natural environments, for example, in South Africa and Finland, where we have been doing work related to conservation science and studied national parks, for example, and what, for example, social media data could tell us about the activities done in those places. But in this presentation, I won't talk actually anything about the social media work, but I'm mostly focusing on the accessibility and mobility things, as that's the things of what I've been doing lately. So when we think about accessibility, it's this kind of a quite nice concept in a sense, because it relates to our everyday activities. For example, the decisions that we make, whether we how do we travel to work, for example. But at the same time, it also comes to this kind of much higher level things, and it binds together questions about traffic, land use, housing, trade, and the environment. And as such, it also relates a lot to sustainability and carbon footprints and so on. So how we have been looking at accessibility, which can be measured in a simple manner, for example, travel time from location to another. So what we have been doing is that we have been wanting to understand the dynamism in the accessibility. And how we have approached this thing is to basically look at these kind of three different accessibility components that are basically people. So of course, when we think about cities, for example, so there are people who are traveling from location to another, and there are these kind of dynamisms happening in those mobility patterns. And then we have transportation, so the transport systems, for example, that are also very much dynamic. So for example, the public transport schedules are varying throughout the day, and also the congestion levels and so on. And then we have activities such as, well, for example, we need to go to work, and there are certain kind of temporal patterns in how people are conducting activities in the cities. So one of the examples of what kind of information we then can actually get out from these analyses are, for example, these kind of accessibility maps that we see here on the left side, which basically shows, this is a work from Claudia Bergerud's MSc thesis. So, and it shows the accessibility patterns to closest grocery store at different hours of the day. So we can see that the kind of accessibility landscape changes quite a bit throughout the day. And then on the right side, what we have is this kind of pulse of the city, and the map that moves in there basically shows the population distribution in the Helsinki region at different hours of the day based on mobile phone data. So we can see, for example, there's this kind of a heart pumping in the city center of Helsinki, which very clearly comes from the results. So then if we think about accessibility, so that's kind of a potential for movement. And then on the right side, we have the actual realized mobility. So what we have been doing is to basically combine these two layers together and to kind of try to grasp the accessibility realities in cities at very high scale. So these are basically 250 meter grid cell that we are looking at, but we can also look at larger scale movements and mobilities. This is an example from mobile phone movements within one day in Finland. This is a map made by Tuomas Väisänen, who is a PhD candidate at DGL. So we can also look at very larger scale patterns in countries, within countries. But then how does this relate to sustainable mobility? So the previous examples that I showed you related very much to understanding the travel times and so on. And that is the very classical way of looking at accessibility and measuring accessibility and movement. But we can also basically go and try to understand what happens during the trips and what kind of what accumulates from those trips. So what I'm at the moment doing is basically try to create tools and models to understand the CO2 emissions from those trips. But also we can look at the monetary, so that how much money goes to the moving in the cities and so on, how many calories would be burned if we, for example, cycle between locations. And this map and the animation actually shows the bike sharing system trips in Helsinki. Helsinki area. And then other aspect what DGL, Digital Geography Lab, is very much doing at the moment is to look at the exposures during these trips. So we can, for example, how people are exposed to pollution, for example, if they cycle between certain routes and look at the air quality kind of things. Then they could be looking at noise exposure, green exposure, or even aesthetic exposures. So there are lots of things that can be looked when we think about the things that happen during the trips. And then what very much interests me and also the larger group is to understand whether this kind of information, if we would be able to actually kind of provide it to people, so could it actually trigger this kind of behavioral change to more sustainable commuting? So could we use this kind of accurate sustainability information and mapping to kind of make better incentives and policies to trigger, for example, using so that the people would use public transport or cycling instead of driving by car. And of course, this is very much, there has been a lot of research about this already. And one of the things why I'm especially interested in commuting is the fact that, of course, transport and commuting produces a lot of emissions, and it's very likely even to increase in the future. Let's now see what this coronavirus thing kind of produces as a result. Do we make changes to our behavior? But anyway, that has been the trend, so that the mobility has increased all the time. But then at the same time, there is a lot of potential actually to change the commuting habits. For example, in UK, and the average car trip that is done is less than 5 kilometers long for 67% of the trips. So, and those kind of like trips that are less than 5 kilometers long, they could be very easily be done by bike, for example. So there is a lots of potential to actually make this behavioral change in there. But of course, achieving this kind of behavioral changes is not easy at all. And it requires kind of quantitative indicators that are relevant, measurable, and easy to communicate to anyone, basically. And what I have been now working on is to basically create tools and models to estimate commuting related carbon emissions with high spatial resolution and temporal granularity. And in this work, what I'm doing is to basically combine the mobility analytics, so using this kind of big data such as mobile phone data or any kind of information that informs about the real locations and movements of people, and then combine this mobility analytics to accessibility modeling, where we basically can model and try to estimate the routes that people are taking. So on the left side here, we have basically three components. So we have the mobility, so try to understand the origins and destinations of the trips and also the mode of travel, and this can be combined to the distance information traveled by different travel modes. This is basically the accessibility component. And when combined these information with the greenhouse gas emission factors, so if we know that kilometer of the trip was traveled with car, we can multiply these emission factors to those distances to get the actual carbon footprint of a single trip. And then in the end, the idea is to use data fusion and these kind of methods to make citywide building level greenhouse gas emission maps. So that's kind of, it's a bold target, but that's what I would like to do, so that we would have easily understandable information on a building level about the carbon emissions caused by movements, and that this would be also temporally sensitive. so that it's not only one snapshot in a year, but we could actually follow up the changes. And at the moment, what I'm developing is to create this environmentally aware routing tool. So basically, try to create this kind of easy to use tool that could be used to analyze shortest paths between locations, and at the same time produce cumulative information about the travel costs, so the time and distance, but also the CO2 information or monetary cost, for example. And then, of course, the latter part is to use this information and try to understand whether this information could promote sustainable mobility. So could this information be used to inform policies and promote sustainable mobility? And here the idea is to, of course, work with the relevant stakeholders, so policymakers and researchers who are more aware and knowledgeable about these kind of policy perspectives, as I'm not an expert in these. But the idea is that would it be, for example, possible to set building or small area level targets and follow up the progress in these locations? I'm now lost of track of the time, but very quickly, so we and a couple of colleagues from US, Brazil, and UK, we also have this kind of special issue at the moment where we focus on these things and invite papers about the kind of sustainable net transport analytics. But that's it. Thank you.
Great job time-wise, Henrikki, and thank you for a very nice and concise presentation. I think we have one quite interesting question in the chat box. Can you read it yourself, or maybe I can read it also out loud? It's easier, maybe you.
Yeah, let's see if I stop.
So the question is about could that kind of mobile data be used to optimize bus companies' carbon emissions?
Yeah, basically, yeah, that's kind of one of the ideas in these tools and in using these information. So is to kind of provide alternatives and provide information that if we do this compared to some other alternatives, so what is the difference? And that is actually something that what we have been doing, for example, for the city of Espoo. So we provided the kind of analytic tools for them to understand the land moving operation kind of environmental costs. So if they would build a new location for dropping the land masses, where should it be built, and how much would that actually reduce the carbon emissions because of the driving of those land masses with trucks to the location. So that's very much those kind of things kind of can be done, and that's one of the targets as well.
Okay, good. There's also another question coming from Eva Brimmer. It goes like this. Could you imagine what kind of policies could be used to implement the target set with the help of the information you describe? And I think Eva is here suggesting to kind of a graded fees for time windows of areas. I'm not sure I follow what there is at the parentheses. Can you, in any case, Henrikki, pick up the question?
Yeah, look at the target.
Or do you want to, Eva, put your mic on and repeat?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I was just, I'm a policy researcher by background, I can reveal that. So I was just imagining when you said that this could be used by policy, that how could we then use it by policy? That what can we do with the information? If we have regional targets, how are those regional targets then manipulated? How are the people So if you have any ideas, if you have thoughts about that,
that's a very good question, and I have been thinking about this, and actually I applied some funding from Academy. Unfortunately, didn't get it, but there the idea was to use this information and basically bring it to, for example, to the workplaces. So if doing these kind of campaigns, for example, on a workplace level, thinking that if we would be able to go, for example, to a building level information. So for example, the university campuses, they are such a broad area, and it's basically one employer in that area. So the idea is that if we can get the information to that level, so that we could measure, for example, on a monthly basis, the kind of cumulative CO2 produced from commuting to the workplace, to the university. So if that information would be available, then we could do university level campaigns, for example, where we specify the targets that last month our emissions were this, and now let's try to kind of go to the, let's try to do it better. So that's one of the ideas. But indeed, I'm not a kind of policy researcher myself, but that's one of the ideas that I have had.
Yes, just one comment on that, voluntary campaigns are a really good way to bring positive attention to initiatives, but then it's always good to bring them up along with some kind of more regulatory approach, so that you could like somehow compare what the benefit of the voluntariness is. But yeah, we can continue talking about this another time, or maybe you find good colleagues to talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. This is a very interesting topic, so very happy to discuss more.
Okay, I'm sorry to break your dialogue here, and we need to move on to the second presentation. So could you please, Antti, start sharing your screen? So next we have here a senior researcher, Antti Rehunen, who comes from Finnish Environment. Title is Climate Impacts of Urban Land Use and Mobility, but from a little bit different perspectives. And you use, your background is work at SYKE, especially in the land use management unit, part of Environmental Policy Center. And there are lots of interesting stuff that you have obviously been engaged in. So please, Antti, air is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation and introduction. And yes, I'm quite nicely actually continuing what Henrikki discussed previously, and we have about 20 people in SYKE working in urban land use issues, mobility issues, and I'm very much leaning on the work of these two groups in SYKE. My starting point here is that the development of urban areas causes emissions from transport, from the energy use of the built environment, and of course also the construction of new buildings and infrastructure. And I'm using the concept of urban form here to define the different emission levels, and by urban form I mean how housing, job services, leisure areas and other urban functions are located in relation to each other, and how they are connected by transport system and other infrastructure. And urban form, it has a kind of enabling character. It more directly, it has an effect on daily mobility patterns, infrastructure needs and land use changes, but then more indirectly also on buildings, energy sources, many different kinds of urban functions. And it can be measured as, for example, as the density of population, jobs or buildings, and accessibility of travel destinations, exactly what Henrikki was dealing with, and also multifunctionality of urban areas. And just as a brief background on what SYKE has done on these topics, we have published reports, studies, looking at the development of urban form over the last decades. And one of our specialties is producing spatial delineations, identifying different types of areas and combining these delineations with survey data and emission factors, for example. And we developed indicators of urban form and land use and compared urban form in different city regions, for example, Helsinki and Stockholm or Oslo. and also made analysis of the dynamics within the urban regions, how centers, different sub-centers, for example, are developing in relation to each other. And not to forget also the analysis on green infrastructure as part of the urban form. We have used different GIS data for the spatial delineations and in the analysis, such as urban rural typology, localities, densely and sparsely built locality, settlements, or travel related urban zones. And I'm getting more into that soon. And also, we've been involved in the development of different emission calculators. We have a web-based KECO tool that SYKE is maintaining for urban planning. It calculates, for example, CO2 emissions for next 50 years and visualizes them. And we have also been involved in the production of a map-based emission mapping tool for the city of Tampere. It was developed by 3 consultancies and in cooperation with the SYKE. And there's a mean to visualize emissions on a grid scale on map. And one of our key tools is the definition and delineation of travel-related urban zones, meaning pedestrian zones, public transport zones with different travel times and headways of public transport, and then car-dependent zones. And we have identified these zones in all Finnish urban regions. Here is the map of Helsinki city region as an example. And using the indicator data, we have studied the development of urban form in general in Finland. And one of the findings is that in terms of physical structure, I think there's a long-lasting trend of urban sprawl, but it has slowed down in Finland during the last years and even come to an end in the biggest city regions. For example, population density has starting to grow in Helsinki city region. But however, functionally, urban regions, they still remain quite dispersed. The car dependence has grown, and for example, the opportunities for people to do home-to-work trips by public transport, walking or cycling, it has decreased in all city regions. So either the home is in a location where you can't access easily public transport or walk to cycle to work, or the workplace is located in that kind of location. So going more into detail in emissions, we have combined urban zone areas to travel survey data and emission factors and calculated daily kilometers per day per person using different modes of transport in different areas and CO2 emissions. And the results show actually quite clear dependence on the location. So distance to the city center and specific urban zone, they have impacts on the average travel behavior and emissions. And for example, in Helsinki city region, emissions in the outer car zone, they are approximately 3 times compared to the city center pedestrian zone. And we can see also the impact of density in car ownership quite clearly. So here on the horizontal scale, we have combined population and job density, and in very low density figures, the majority of the households, they have more than 2 or more cars, and when the density starts to get bigger, this most typical type of households is 1-car household, and in a very dense areas, actually the majority are carless households. And we can see the dependence on the density also in infrastructure needs. So this graph shows the street length in meters per building floor area in square meters according to area density. And the denser we have the area, the less we need streets and other infrastructure for the floor square meter. So in very low density, low rise areas, the requirement is manifold compared to the more dense areas. And even if we have areas of detached houses, which are more dense, so that situation is already much better to compare to the very low density areas. And land use changes, they have an impact on carbon sinks and storages, and we have been monitoring how much land is used for buildings, expansion of the built-up area to natural areas, other unbuilt areas, and here we can see the development in different sized city regions. And actually in large city regions, there's much less unbuilt land used for new buildings compared to smaller city regions. So the rate of building new buildings is very high, particularly in Helsinki city region during the last years, but the expenditure of unbuilt land is relatively quite small. And what is interesting that during the last years we have turned to more high-rise building infill development, and you can see it clearly affecting the expansion of the built-up area. So it has really come to almost on one half what it was 10 years ago now. And well, looking at mobility, land use, different aspects in the assessment of carbon emissions, you have to integrate different aspects. And here's an example map from Tampere city, where the biggest source of emissions is identified, and you can see the travel related urban zones on the background. And I collected some examples of CO2 emissions from our KECO calculator and in CO2 tons per floor area square meter. And this is total during the following 50 years, and tried to compare different planning choices and what kind of range of emissions are related to them. So for example, good versus poor location in urban form, or different building materials, wood, concrete, other materials, and the reuse of existing buildings versus construction of new buildings, and high or low density land use impacting carbon sinks and storages. And maybe the biggest factor is energy use of buildings, energy sources. So there's a very big range from almost zero emissions to very high emissions. And one of the conclusions is that to really cut the emissions, you have to be making wise decisions at many different levels here, in many different choices. And just to sum up, what are effective climate actions in land use and mobility? It's the infill development, use of existing infrastructure. So there's no need to open up so many new areas if you can use the existing ones. It's also reusing existing buildings if you can improve the energy efficiency, and locating jobs and services close to public transport hubs. I think there's more attention being paid on the location of housing, but the location of jobs is also of high importance here. And developing good quality cycling routes is maybe one of the most cost-efficient ways to change the way people travel to work or other places. And also avoiding the expansion of car-dependent zones. Many cities have still in their plans kind of expansion areas, but they should really be considering if they want to open them up, or should they just renew their plans. And in the end, also, we have different kinds of urban areas, different urban fabrics in our cities, walking, transit, car-dependent areas. And we can't change them all in kind of same kind of manner, but we should be recognizing their situation and specifying goals for them, and developing them each from their own perspective. And just to end, I listed here some further research and development needs that we have came across in our emission assessments of urban plans with the cities. And one issue is updating travel behavior data. We have new travel surveys available, and things might change. And challenging is to predict how the mobility really changes in the future. For example, home to work trips after Corona when people have get used to work from home. And circular economy is coming more and more important, as Henrikki discussed, how we deal with different materials, land masses, logistics with them. How does it impact on land use and emissions? And carbon sinks and storages maybe in more detail in the future, and thinking of soil carbon, for example. Infrastructure developments, new rail tram lines are planned or built at the moment, and they should be maybe assessed in more detail as well. And also the impacts of the foundation, the groundwork for buildings and infra, on what kind of soil they are built. Maybe the best soils are now built and we have kind of more challenging places left. And energy production, much is changing also there, but also local energy sources production and use, how to take it into account in the assessments. And last, the decision of renovation or demolition of existing buildings. So if we build new, we cause carbon peak, but we get improved energy efficiency in the new buildings. Thank you.
Thank you, Antti. It was an excellent and timely presentation, if I may say. I see there's at least one question coming up, or is it two actually, two parts in the chat. So I think the question goes like, how it could be tested and piloted now, this referring to this COVID-19 crisis period. What kind of challenges in testing? And okay, I have to perhaps read that loud out again to get to the bottom of myself. But I think it's referring to this current situation, and what kind of lessons learned can you draw from there. And I think the follow-up question is dealing with the KECO tool, and on the one hand, and also regarding, I think the first part is dealing with sustainable tourism. Is that what you are referring, the person who made the question? I can only see TJ Lappalainen as a name. How is it, Antti? Can you figure out? So there are at least, I think, two questions.
Yeah, I think this Corona situation is very interesting, thinking of using services, doing work, and we have some studies that show that people might be willing to continue work from home after the situation has gone over. So we need to maybe get more data and learn from the situation now. At least it changes the way we look at commuting trips and calculating their emissions. And we have new travel surveys planned for next year by Traficom, so it will be interesting to see what the situation is then, and when we get the results, and maybe can update our emission calculation over there. We have mainly focused on daily mobility, so leaving kind of longer trips and tourism outside, and on the basis that urban form is really affecting trips within the region. Of course, it has an impact also on longer trips. If you live in a very dense area, some of the people might be willing to compensate it for having a second home or traveling somewhere else, nature. But that's kind of more complicated issue, and we haven't really dealt with that so much in this kind of calculations.
Okay, thank you, Antti. It was, in any case, a very, very timely question, and probably this gives you also some follow-up research ideas that you already elaborated a little bit about this predicting the future mobility ideas. I think we are facing the situation that we have to now move on to the third presentation, even though I see that there is a follow-up question, but we can come back to these unanswered questions later on. So next we have Anna Repo, who is an academic postdoc coming from Luke, and Anna's presentation is dealing with the land-based climate change mitigation and especially the connection with biodiversity conservation and from the synergies and trade-offs perspective. So please don't give up those that didn't get your questions answered. We will have time a little bit after Anna is finished, but let's take this first. And by the way, I'm really happy and proud to see that there have been at least about 75 participants in the seminar. It's an excellent achievement. But please, Anna, air is yours.
And University of Jyväskylä on these topics on trade-offs and synergies. How can land be best used for both climate change mitigation and biodiversity conservation? This is the big question that motivates me in my research. The stewardship of land holds solutions to limit the global warming to well below 2 degrees and to halt biodiversity loss. But meeting the climate goals set in the Paris Agreement requires a rapid reduction in CO2 emission and also removing significant amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So in other words, negative emissions are needed. The land use sector contributes to meeting the climate goals in 2 ways. So first, by providing bioenergy to replace fossil fuels, and if bioenergy is combined with carbon capture and storage, so BECCS, also negative emissions. The second way is by natural carbon sequestration in vegetation and soil. And currently, natural carbon sequestration in terrestrial ecosystems removes approximately 1/3 of the annual anthropogenic CO2 emissions. But both land-based climate change mitigation options, so bioenergy and with biodiversity conservation. Global studies show that biodiversity is likely to suffer if converting forests and other land for bioenergy production is a major component of climate change mitigation. So if we have massive changes in land use, we will also harm biodiversity. What we also know from previous studies is that converting ecosystems that contain high amounts of carbon, such as forests, into bioenergy crop cultivations may cause significant losses of carbon from the ecosystems. And these losses will partly or even entirely offset the emission savings that we can get from replacing fossil fuels with bioenergy. But these effects are not limited only to land use change. Our previous research shows that bioenergy may pose a risk to biodiversity and carbon storage in ecosystems even without the land use change. So in other words, when forest land stays as forest land, but for example, harvesting intensity is increased. An example of increasing harvesting intensity is producing bioenergy from forest harvest residues. And forest harvest residues are stumps, branches, and other residual biomass that has been previously left to the forest after harvest operation. We have been doing a series of modeling studies ranging from single lands to larger landscapes. And the main findings of these studies are the following. So first of all, producing bioenergy from forest harvest residues speeds up the forest carbon cycle, and therefore bioenergy from forest harvest residues is not carbon or climate neutral. Also, logging residue harvesting in our study increased the destruction and removal of large diameter dead trees, and even halved the amount of some decay classes of snags and logs. It reduced the combined species conservation capacity of deadwood-dependent well-listed fungi, insect, and lithium species by 1/5. So one could say that logging residue harvesting for bioenergy actually conflicts with the past and ongoing efforts to increase the amount of dead wood in forests with the aim to halt biodiversity loss. Well, the IPCC scenario sent a strong message about the need for carbon removal from the atmosphere. One shortcoming of the climate change mitigation pathways of the IPCC that are charted with the integrated assessment models is that they accommodate climate policy goals, but do not explicitly include biodiversity goals. And in my research project, which carries the same name as this presentation, so trade-offs and synergies in land-based climate change mitigation and biodiversity conservation, so TRACY for friends, I'm looking together with my colleagues into this problematic. And next, I will briefly present the motivation of the project and research questions. So many of the IPCC climate change mitigation pathways deploy bioenergy and BECCS on a massive scale. And this implies also massive changes in land use. So from previous literature, we know that there is, or there may be a conflict between large-scale bioenergy deployment and other land-based policy goals, such as biodiversity conservation. So the first question that we're looking into is how severe is the trade-off at the level of land use between climate mitigation goals with bioenergy and biodiversity goals. Combining bioenergy production with agricultural intensification or avoiding deforestation by putting a price on CO2 emissions from land use change have been shown to reduce pressure for deforestation and also to reduce emissions there from land use change. Nevertheless, it has also been shown that carbon-only strategies that aim to conserve high carbon ecosystems are not necessarily effective at conserving biodiversity. And this is because geographical distributions of terrestrial carbon stocks and biodiversity hotspots or priority areas may differ. So the second question is that we are addressing, to what extent could agricultural intensification or putting a price to CO2 emission help to alleviate the land use conflict between climate change mitigation with bioenergy and biodiversity conservation. Previous studies also indicate that maintaining and increasing carbon stocks in natural ecosystems may provide, in that addition to improved climate regulation, also other synergies with biodiversity conservation in forest ecosystems, for example. But often this synergy assumption is based on reasoning that forest cover, so the area of forest, provides carbon storage and habitat quantity. But yet there are not that many studies that look into this synergy assumption from the point of view of habitat quality. And the third question that we are looking is what is the potential of improved forest management to deliver cost-effective negative emissions while improving habitat quality in boreal forests. And the first two questions we're planning to answer with the help of outputs of global land use models. And the last question builds on methodologically on the model development that we have been doing at the University of Jyväskylä in the research group led by Viikki and Tenkanen. Okay, with this, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Anna, for your introduction of your research questions and an overall setting the scene on these questions. Now we have still about 10 minutes time for joint discussion. So I just check there are no questions coming from the Twitter hashtag, but there's at least one new question to Anna in the chat box. It goes like this. Biodiversity goals versus carbon emission goals. Which of those goals are the most complex challenges? Okay, that is a rather big question.
Yeah, this is a super difficult question. If you are referring to kind of the general carbon emission goals, then it comes to all the systems, because there are also energy system and other systems than land use. So I'm not sure if I can answer what is the most complex challenge.
Mm. Yeah, both are very, very challenging. I think that could be one kind of a way to approach it. Any other questions to Anna in particular? So I'd like to ask, what is your next step in terms of your project?
The corona situation changed my plans a bit. I will be spending summer in Finland and not in Austria. So I'm currently looking into this third question on improving forest management to provide win-win solutions for carbon stocks and habitat quality.
Okay, great. We look forward to hearing more about those results. If there are no further questions specifically to Anna, we can maybe go back because there were a couple of still. I think those were targeted towards Antti's presentation. Are you, Antti, still here with us? You can turn on your mic also. Hello, Antti.
Sorry, I just lost a couple of words, but yes.
Earlier, a couple of questions targeted to you, I believe.
Yes, yeah, good questions. They remind me that we have reform on land use and building legislation now going in Finland, and it seems that maybe the first priority goal will be this low carbon or carbon neutrality in land use planning. And as some of the results show, it means quite dense building, or at least kind of a consolidated urban form where trips are made using mostly by sustainable modes of transport. But we really shouldn't look at the carbon neutrality on its own only, but thinking also of the quality of the environment, the welfare of the people. And as some of the people who made the questions point out, that maybe looking at only density might lead to people wanting to flee from the cities, going to summer houses or some other places, and so we should really plan these carbon actions in the cities in close connection to the environmental quality. And I think in some respects these could be joined in having a very good detailed planning of nice neighborhoods and still having quite dense environments. But of course people want also to change the landscape, and maybe having a good working urban form enables them using public transport, sustainable modes of transport also on the leisure trips to more far away places.
Okay, yeah. There's also, I think this is from Susanna Lehtavirta, and this is more like a comment, but yeah, maybe you partly already answered that one as well. So about city planning, so that it can accommodate a different type of pleasant environment. There was also one question above. I think it was dealing with the green-blue infrastructure kind of question.
Yeah,
can you see it?
Yeah, that's also a good point. That I didn't actually deal with it very much, but we have some studies. For example, my colleague Maija Tiitu, who has examined the opportunities for infill development and taking into account the green infrastructure in the city. So looking at the places which might be critical for the green infrastructure, which might be the best for infill development, and trying to find kind of best suitable places, so not harming too much green infra, to use for maybe building some new buildings and areas that should be really preserved as important parts of the green infra. And so I think having these two perspectives together and analyzing the urban areas and plans using GIS, different GIS data sets might be kind of a good solution for this kind of issue.
Exactly. And there's also, I think, a related comment in the chat box about the COVID times and the importance of quality and extent of outdoor green spaces having a role.
Yeah.
I don't see any further questions to you, Antti, but there's a kind of a little bit of discussion ongoing in terms of Anna's presentation. Do you want to, Anna, a little bit come back to your there's one question. Yeah, this ash returning to the forest, I think that is targeted to you. Are you, Anna, still around here?
I'm here.
Can you see the comment or rather a question? Trees need CO2, water and minerals. What else?
So this is a question related to ash fertilization that I don't know anything about, but I'm sure that my colleagues in Luke know about this topic, but I unfortunately don't know about this topic.
Yeah, we better drop it there. Are there any questions to Henrikki, for example, or jointly for all of these excellent presenters here today? Sorry, my connection is not 100% functional. So if I want to see if somebody has been raising hand, I have to ignore the chat box, but I don't see any raised hand reflections here in either. Anything that any of you presenters would like to kind of fill in this point, or are we happy to conclude already? We still have 51 devoted participants online, so now would be time for one quick question. Okay, I see something happening in the chat box. Oh, okay. Okay, just Juha Karjalainen flagging an Yle piece of news. All right. Okay, I see Aleksi Lehtonen having a question to Anna. We will take that as a final question, and after that we conclude. So please, Aleksi, you can open your mic.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering about the Anna's presentation, and I was thinking when you were talking about the increasing the need of bioenergy and also the having the biodiversity aspects simultaneously taken into account, and then we are also harvesting wood in order to be used. Do you see that the like the intensity of wood use and different levels of intensity be taken into account? And I was also wondering, is the biodiversity issue, is it like an on-off, that it's either conservation, or do you have a different levels of improving the biodiversity? I'm just wondering that you may end up with the multiple combinations when you have the different intensity of wood use and the different levels of biodiversity. Or do you see that the biodiversity and bioenergy is kind of on-off variables in your analysis?
They are not necessarily on and off, because one could also think that in some cases from the biodiversity side, it might be actually good to intensify forest use in some places, meaning that we will kind of leave more area untouched, and then we use intensively the land that we are actually using. If you think about the kind of optimization, that could be one outcome. And then about your next question about the kind of the biodiversity aspects, is it only conservation? I see that it's not only conservation, but it's related to actions that we can do to improve the habitat quality. So not only the quantity, but the quality. And I think it's pretty obvious that nowadays we need also climate and biodiversity actions on managed land also. So the amount of conserved land is not enough. So we need to increase that, but also we need to do more actions on managed land. I hope that these answered to your question.
Yes, thanks.
Okay, I think this is a good point of ending this seminar. Thank you very much for all presenters, those who have been actively participating in discussion part, and also all of those who have followed us on the stream link. And I'm unfortunately not able to announce the next seminar, but I can promise that we come back to this concept after summer, and there will be more hopefully interesting topics to appear in the Viikki Sustainability Research Seminar. So thank you very much and stay safe.